All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. We are here at the annual SynerComm IT Summit. It's actually the 18th year. I will not date myself. This is my first year, but we will date Kirk by saying that this is his 18th year of doing this IT Summit. The section we're in today is Industry Visionary Series. So talking with various different industry visionaries and veterans about technology. So I'm going to kick it off. But before we do here, let me introduce our two speakers today, Bob Friday with Juniper Networks and Mist, as well as Kirk from SynerComm. So Bob, can you talk a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Yeah, so my background's been mostly wireless networking for most of my career. For those who remember back in the Metricom Ricochet days, really started with kind of, the visions of building out nationwide wireless unlicensed mesh networks. From there, went off and started a company called Airspace. That was really focused on helping enterprises with controllers. Cisco bought that company back in the mid 2000s. I was a mobility CTO at Cisco for 8 years or so. And from there left and really started a company called Mist. And that was really around cloud and AI. And from there, we sold that one to Juniper. So I'm at Juniper now, really, doing AI and networking.
Awesome. So what is the most fun thing you've been doing during COVID this year?
Yeah, COVID has got a silver lining. So for Thanksgiving, right, we had kind of the thanks. What do we have to be thankful about the COVID? Because there's the other side of COVID. And it turns out COVID's actually brought families together too, right? Working from home is basically like, a lot of people get to see their family a lot more than they have. And so there's kind of a silver lining there with COVID. Also, COVID has brought more dogs, right? It's hard to get a dog now. In the old days, I used to be able to go to the pound to get a dog. It's hard to get dogs. You have more time to get dogs. So those have been some of the highlights of my COVID experience so far, and kind of the more positive side of the COVID adventure.
Nice. Yeah. I can't agree more. Kirk, what about you?
Yeah, like you said, we've been doing the IT Summit here for like 18 years, and kind of been interesting. When we started SynerComm 30 years ago, kind of went through these big shifts from kind of PCs were breaking into the mainframe world. Then you had the network PC, the networking come around, like Novell and all that. And how do you network these things together and share data and printers and all that? And then you moved on to, so we kind of went through that. And then companies tried to consolidate onto the LAN and the WAN, things like, the 3Com, Bay networks, all those worlds we lived through. And then switching, and then dial-up access and all that fun stuff, these paradigm shifts that people went through. And then the emergence of Wi-Fi, and then the whole internet came around, and that became a big deal. And then we worked with like the Neoterraces and SSL VPN and the web proxies for user filtering, and then next gen firewall. So it's been kind of fun. All the cloud eras amongst us. So being able to get an opportunity to talk to someone like Bob, who's actually been in the Silicon Valley. Now he's done 2 different startups that successfully finished. A pleasure for us.
So before we get into the objective, Kirk, which I'd like for you to kind of outline before we get started here, why don't you talk a little bit about your racing career?
My son's mean? Yes. Yeah, exactly. Well, it's been more and more in the Silicon Valley too, but my son was 18 about 8 years ago now, and we just actually got involved in racing and moved up through the layers, and now we're into the IMSA and the road to Indy. So I've always had a kind of like with fast networks and the racing cars and the competitiveness. It was an outlet that I enjoyed actually. And at my age, I raced a little bit when I was younger, but I thought it'd be better to invest in my son's racing and me being the fan watching and cheering versus trying to drive the car myself. So it's kind of a parallel emergence over the last decade here. And my son is in the IMSA, and he's raced over in Europe in the European Le Mans series too. So it's been a fun distraction when I'm not working. So it's kind of a wound out. Then I know Bob likes wine. That's another distraction I enjoy myself out in Napa Valley periodically. So lots of fun experiences in life throughout basically last 30 years being tied to the Silicon Valley as kind of more of an advocate and trying to sell things out on our end of the world.
Very cool. All right, Kirk. So what are we talking about today?
We are talking about the AI, the journey to the AI-driven enterprise, primarily starting with the Wi-Fi. And what is Bob? He's had this vision 3 or 4 years ago. What made him actually act on that vision? And then kind of the journey, the lessons learned to where we are today, and then where the whole AI-driven enterprise is going tomorrow. Obviously, there's a lot of hype around AI, and someone like Bob can actually cut through that and give some of our audience practical things, and as well as lessons learned about a journey to the AI-driven enterprise.
All right, well, let's go.
All right. So given a longer than short there, Bob, we talked about, what was that initial impetus to go and start Mist?
Yeah.
And, and take that forward. That's an amazing story to me. And then what kind of vision does it also take to do something like that? You have to kind of do things before the mainstream, obviously, to get them to market when the market's ready for them. So I guess any perspective there would be great.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, Kirk, because when I started Mist, everyone thought I was crazy. They're like, Bob, what the heck are you doing? Why do we need another wireless company out there? There's plenty of AP companies out there. Why are you starting another wireless company? But I'd say the adventure started back in the, like I say, early 2000s when I was doing aerospace. I would say that adventure was really around, hey guys, we're going to help enterprise guys kind of manage all these access points, right? That's back in the early days of Wi-Fi when it was really a nice to have. It's actually hard to sell. People forget, back 20, 30 years ago, it was really hard to sell Wi-Fi. People were like, why do you need it? But when I got to Cisco, Wi-Fi kind of went from this nice to have to, okay, it's a must have, right? We kind of got to that point. Okay, guys, we understand why we need it. Why do I have this wireless network? I've got a perfectly good wired network. Why do I need another network? But when I was at Cisco, I started to hear customers, and this is some big retail customers, and they were starting to put robots and consumer things, consumer apps, on your phone and stuff. And they were kind of the opinion, hey, before I'm going to put my actual customer on this network, one is, they're like, Bob, you got to stop your controllers from crashing. Two, they're like, you got to be able to keep up with my digital, hey, I've got this program, right? I'm trying to build a mobile app for my customer, and they were basically developing apps every month, right? They could release code once a month, and they were moving at warp speed. And the network was still moving at kind of the, hey, we'll get a release to you every year, right? Every year, every once or twice a year, we may be able to get you a new piece of code out there. And then finally, they came back and they kind of said, we really don't care about the access point. We really care about the end-to-end user connectivity experience, right? And that was the beginnings of what I call a couple of market transitions, right? Where Wi-Fi went from a nice to have to a must have. Now we're starting to see wireless really become business critical. It was getting that next phase of, they're putting, it got to really work well now. And two, they wanted visibility. And so that was kind of the beginnings of, okay, there's need for a new cloud AI architecture. And, and back then we just got done acquiring Meraki, kind of a cloud company. But the more I looked at it, it was like, hey, if you really want to do AI, you've got to have a whole different architecture. You got to have real-time pipelines. It's not just about moving data to the cloud and doing configuration. If you want to process data in real time, that required kind of a new cloud architecture. And that's when I kind of saw the opportunities like, okay, guys, should I do this inside of a big company? And my general rule is, hey, when you see things like this happening, it's hard when you see architectural things change. It's hard for big companies to do that internally. So that's when I decided, this is kind of a startup. It's easier to go raise money, blank sheet of paper. When you see architectural changes happening, that's kind of what happened at aerospace. My general rule I will tell you is when you see big companies trying to get 3 or 4 BUs to work together, that's usually a sign that something's changing architecturally in the industry.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point you make, because the last 4 or 5 years that we were working with wireless, it was more about controllers versus controllers. And did that maybe set the stage for the AI also by maybe making more of the centralized, these different types of configuration models or monitoring models?
Well, I mean, you look what happened, and you look at the timeline and things of what happened, right? I think it was like, when did AWS come around? It was like 2010 or something.
Ago.
We had mobile. We had the iPhone come around 2007.
Yep.
Those were kind of the technology changes. Cloud was becoming more real, in that time frame. AI was starting to become more real around 2014. So those were kind of the technology transitions that were happening. For me personally, one of the inspirations for Mist was really when I saw Watson play Jeopardy, right? I don't know if you remember that phase of it. I'm like, you guys, if they can build something that can play Jeopardy at championship level, we should be able to build something that can answer questions on par of network domain experts, right? It's like,
Right.
I just want to play one category of Jeopardy. I don't need to play the whole world. I just want to be able to be very good at networking.
Right.
So that was the beginnings of, there's something changing here, right? Cloud, AI, it's time for a new paradigm shift. And the big paradigm shift was really around, but I said back to that customer thing, right? We're not here to help people manage boxes anymore or network elements. We're really here to help them manage some sort of end-to-end user experience, right?
Right. Yeah, that's great. So you mentioned the Watson thing, and then the other thing is that what's amazing kind of about the vision is, I know you went through some different trials on how to leverage AI and maybe some iterations to get to where you are today, to get to that 60% efficacy rate that you're at today, and maybe some of that journey would be interesting for how you actually find out what you need to make AI work. I guess what components are there, and what are the lessons to learn?
Yeah, when I started, if you read the story about Watson, I knew this was going to be about a 4, 5, 6 year adventure, because it took them about that many years to get Watson to play Jeopardy. And in the Mist adventure, it really started with the data piece of it, right? One of the big questions, when Suji and I started Mist was really around, should we build an access point? And really the reason we built an access point was not because we thought the market needed another access point. It was because we wanted to make sure we could get the data we needed to really answer the question of why are you having a connectivity problem? And when you think about AI ML, there's a slight difference, right? AI is really building something that does something on par with a human. ML is a tool that you do to solve a problem, right? And the vision here was really, can we build something that does something on par with a network domain expert? So that journey really began with the data. First of all, and it probably took us a year or two just to get the data we needed into some form. Oh, hang on here.
Okay. Yep.
But, you know what? I forgot about this problem.
Well, it actually looks cool behind you now. It's like you got a shadow now.
Are you good with this? Okay, we'll keep going.
That's fine.
But anyway, yeah. So as I was saying, the journey started with the data, and making sure we could answer that question: why are you having a connectivity problem? And that's why we started the access point, because the access point has 80% of the data you need to really answer that question. But I would tell you, most of our customers, even before we got to the AI piece of this,
right,
customers just saw value of getting the data to the cloud, right? Because the same data, if you think about Marvis as this AI assistant, the same data that Marvis needed to basically help answer this question is the data that an IT administrative team needs to look at. And they appreciate the fact that it was structured in such a way that we could apply data science to. So it has a very structured format that a real person would say, yeah, that's exactly what I need too, right? And so that's where we got started.
That's really interesting. So I know a lot of times in the past, it's been difficult for networking companies to really do well with application layer things. It seems like that's been a challenge over the years, even with acquisitions. When they start, and networking companies get on the end node, they struggle a lot. It seems like, just with different, whether it's a security initiative or whatever the initiative may be. I guess, how do you separate, how did you find the right data points you could get, I guess, to actually tell if an application's performing? And when there's so many applications out there, and it's not a small challenge to take on.
Well, and that's, I would say, and that's where we are on the journey now, right? After joining Juniper, we started the journey with the access point, which really helped us answer questions about, connectivity. At Juniper now, we're starting to basically ingest data from the router, the SD-WAN piece of it, right? And that really starts to let us answer questions about the application, right? Because the router is what has all that session level layer 3 through 7 information. And so that really starts to let us start answering the question of, why is a user having a Zoom problem, right? And so the router starts to bring in more information. And then overall, you kind of see with this AI journey, where we're headed to as we start to ingest data from the client, the AP, the switch, the router. It lets us answer more questions. What, like, why is the app having a problem? And it really lets us answer more questions with granularity. Now I can go, if I have the router information, I can tell you if you're having a WAN problem, right? Because now I have visibility into the WAN interface. I can tell you, have you just lost your fiber connection and moved over to your cellular backup? So that's the power of AI right now, and basically you start ingesting data from multiple sources to getting to root cause of more granularity.
Sure. And I know that as part of your initiative, I know Juniper just did an acquisition of 128 Technologies, and how does that play into the picture, and especially with the pandemic, possibly in more of these micro offices or whatever we want to call them, where people, more and more small offices where it's hard to get a handle on, I guess, the performance characteristics or, the quality of what you're connecting to, I guess, on that end, that last mile, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, that's where everyone's kind of looking at the home as a new micro branch, right? The question is, how are we going to support people working from the home? Are we going to start to put SD-WAN technology in your house? Some sort of form of backup, right? When you're home, you got your broadband connection, should you have a cellular backup ready to go, from your house, like this podcast, right?
Right.
What happens if my internet goes down? I want to make sure that it has some reliability to go back up on the other thing. So yeah, the 128 acquisition was really around next generation SD-WAN router, and as I said, it's really about getting information from that router, especially the 128 session routing. It had kind of a unique characteristic where it gives us more granularity on the individual user. Each session is being tracked as opposed to a tunnel, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas, you lose some visibility, you track a big tunnel that has a lot of sessions in, as opposed to now we have granularity all down to each session that is going through that router.
So to the untrained and person here, I'm just putting things together in my head and seeing all these years of evolution. It almost sounds like some of the same issues that like the next generation firewalls are dealing with, right? Not just the location, but now actually even the performance information inside of there. So is that kind of is those things melding together at some point, I guess? And how does that?
Yeah, that's another, and I would say working from home, that's the SASE trend, right?
Mm-hmm.
As we see people and workloads get distributed, I would say my analogy is in the old days, right? We used to put bumps in the wire, right?
Right.
A firewall was basically, we'll put a bump, we'll put a box somewhere and it'll do some function. Nowadays in the future, I think we're building bumps in the cloud, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
If you look like Zscaler, right? Zscaler is a bump in the cloud. We're going to take all your data, we're going to send it to somewhere in the cloud to do some security function on it.
Right.
So I think that is the trend we're seeing on the cloudification of things, right? We're going to see more bumps in the cloud. The information we get, the AI ops piece is kind of sitting on top of this, right? Question is, as this stuff gets more complex, and that's a challenge IT is facing, right? These networks are getting more complex. It used to be in a simple day, you had a little network, with a firewall, and everything was under your control.
Right. Now, VPN concentrator to get into it, remote SSL, then you really got high tech back then.
Yeah, those days, I feel kind of sorry for the IT, the IT admin of the world today, right? The old days, it was like you were a CCI, you learned your CLI commands and you were good to go. Now we're asking them to be a Python programmer, and we're starting to ask them to even become a little bit of a data science, to actually start to manage all these networks.
Yeah, that's a challenge. Do you have any words of wisdom for people that if they're looking to either, I think part of a person's job is to stay employable if they want to, they got to stay up with technologies and not become a dinosaur. So what would be your recommendations for people to make sure they keep themselves, in the loop, employable, I guess, and not be too specialized or off and not seeing the big picture, being employable in the big picture, I guess.
Well, I think it's clear, especially in the IT space, right? Is learning Python is probably going to be good for your career. In two aspects, right? One is around automation. We're kind of moving to this cloud API world, and more and more IT administrators have to deal with APIs and writing scripts to automate how things get deployed and repeatable. It turns out Python is also the language of data science. So my words of wisdom in the IT is, kind of start to get up to speed on Python. Jupyter Notebook. I don't know if you've heard of Jupyter Notebook. That's another data science tool.
Okay.
I would tell people, anyone who wants to play around with data science, if you take 2 or 3 days, anyone, myself, I did this myself personally. If you just go Google, get Jupyter Notebook and Python, you could have your machine learning model up and running in 2 or 3 days. Just do the very basic, learn how to recognize numbers, right? There's data sets out there. Anyone on this podcast can do that themselves if they really wanted to.
That's great. So that's kind of the people level of things. We've been kind of focusing on the data layer, and then you got to present that layer. And I know that's where you get into Marvis and maybe the assistants and things like that. So I guess, how do you see the role that impacting, what people would be doing in the organization and the role of how IT supports an organization?
Yeah, I guess, my vision, what I see happening is, and I see this across other industries, if you look at doctors, doctors are starting to get AI assistants to help them do diagnosis on MRIs and cancer, right? And to some extent, if you go to your doctor now and they're not using some sort of AI assistant, it's almost malpractice, right? You guys, because we know that these AI assistants are getting very good. We see it in the cars. I think the same true is networking. It's like, it's not replacing jobs. It's really, and you're going to want to have an AI assistant on your team, right? And you're going to want to be able to interact with that AI assistant to the point of trust. I've been talking a lot about lately, AI assistants look a lot like a new employee, right? If you have someone join your team, the first thing is you try to figure out, what can I trust this person to do, right? What's their level of skill, what are they capable of? That's true with the AI assistant. And the same thing, when you bring someone new on your team, you expect them to get better, right? As you teach them things, you expect them to get more skilled and better at what they do. That's true with your AI assistant, right? You want a mechanism to be able to expect your AI assistant to get better as you start telling it, you got it right, you got it wrong. So that's where I kind of see AI assistants evolving, right? They're just going to become another member of the IT team. They help deal with a more complex world.
Right. And then I know a couple of ways here. I guess you can almost say that with the increased exponential complexity of the amount of apps, explosion in apps, and they're located anywhere, that if you don't get this lower level stuff automated, you're probably going to drown and not even be able to do a root cause analysis. I guess that's if you're not the proactive type so say you're a CIO trying to chart your course, it seems like you better be charting this course now so that you understand it better as a couple of years come, or you might just totally fall apart.
Yeah, I mean, and I think as I'm saying, CIOs have their hands full right now with trying to transform their IT teams, right? Let alone, going to AI ops. First of all, we got to get up to API cloud. I mean, I think that's probably the synergy is, when you say the word AI ops, usually cloud, that implies cloud, right? So because you have to get the data somewhere where you can do it, like we were talking to, right? This data science stuff and this deep learning has been around. I did in my master's 30 years ago. My master's was doing neural networks for some communication thing. The only difference now is, we have enough compute power to actually do something with it. Aerospace, I wanted to do it, but you can't really do it on a 1U Linux box, right? There's just not enough horsepower in that Linux box to do what you want to do. With the cloud right now, you're only limited by your Amazon bill, right? I mean, there is no limit on how many cores you can spin up. As long as you can pay your Amazon bill, you're good to go.
So as you start moving, this forward into an organization, and you mentioned that you get, you got to about 60%, and then you're hoping to get further. I guess, what are that efficacy feedback loop? I think there's some lessons to be learned in how you've structured your organization to make sure you have a good feedback loop to make things get better. And I guess, what would you recommend for people, and what have you learned from that?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, right? I mean, when I left Cisco to do this, there was kind of like, hey, one theory was, hey, I need a new architecture. I've got to build a real-time pipeline, which is hard for big organizations to do. But the other thing, there was an organizational component to this. What I found is, as we moved data to the cloud, really the Mist customer support became a proxy for our real customers, right? Because once we had the data in the cloud, we had the same visibility as our customers did into the data. And this is what I'm saying, the customer support model is getting almost turned upside down, right? The days when and it's getting turned upside down in both aspects, right? From businesses to their customer interface, that support model is getting changed. But from the enterprise to the vendor model is getting changed, right? The days of having to argue with your vendor about whether you have a hardware software problem, those days are going away. I mean, because at Mist, I see all your hardware or software problems. I know almost ahead of time, if you're having a hardware software problem. So organizationally, what we did here is we basically took the data science team and tied it to the hip of the customer support team. And that's that efficacy loop, right? So every support ticket that comes into Mist right now, we basically use Marvis to see, Marvis, can you answer this problem, right? And these are the hard support tickets. These are why is the barcode reader in the distribution center not working?
Right.
Why are the customers in store X having a problem? But that loop there, we've gotten to the point where now Marvis can answer about 60% of all support tickets that come in. When I tell people how that really gets done, it's like, self-driving cars, it's not one algorithm. It depends on different classes of problems. We have different algorithms, to deal with different problems. Mutual information helps us find broken DHCP. And we have this temporal correlation, that helps solve the problem of, hey, if someone misconfigures a router that affects, whether or not a user gets onto the network, those are very hard problems. Like someone touches something over here on the site, this part of the network, and it screws up this side of the network. And you swear that it shouldn't do that, right? That should have nothing to do, but it does. That's the type of stuff that AI and ML can help find those needle in the haystack problems.
And I know you mentioned that recently, at least the graph database technology and the relationships and things. How does that play into for an organization to kind of figure out, what is possible and what could have happened, I guess?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, this goes back to, the journey for AI. It starts with the data, but the next part of the journey is really building frameworks on which you can apply AI. So one of the first frameworks we built here is what we called SLE, which really let us apply mutual information, which really let us, whenever a user had a problem or something, it let us to quickly figure out what network feature was most likely cause that problem. And our famous story there is we had a famous big customer that had a distribution center with some barcode readers. They never could figure out, was intermittent what they're having. This technique let us get to the question of, hey, it's really a device with a particular OS. We narrowed it down to that feature that was causing that problem. The graph database is really kind of a event. You think of graph databases being a way to store data and a framework that lets us apply temporal correlation. So that lets us solve problems like, we had another big retail customer, where we were doing a POC, they basically said, hey, you guys, your POC is not working, your competitor is working, but yours is not working. It's like, hey, your stuff isn't working, right? What it turned out to be, temporal correlation was able to let us figure out very, very quickly that what had really happened, and someone had reconfigured a router and changed the MTU size so it would not pass these large authentication packets. So it was preventing these devices from authenticating. And they swore up and down that no changes had been made. But after we did the event correlations, yes, this problem is associated with this event. So that's what the graph database lets you take the data, put it into a format that lets you apply temporal correlation. Does that make sense? That you have frameworks, you have data science.
Is that framework then the thing that allows you to expand because of the, like you just mentioned, the exponential interactions as you get more and more points that can interact with each other, whether it's at the application layer or software layer or any layer of the OSI or within, is that the strategy for dealing with that exponential complexity that comes as you get more and more granular?
That's the framework that lets you basically start ingesting data from more sources, right? Whether it's a DHCP server, a DNS event, or an event coming from a data center, as you start adding more events into this framework, we'd be able to get more answers. So we know, without the WAN interface, I could tell you that the problem is somewhere that side of the AP. But once I start ingesting events from the SD-WAN router, I can now tell you exactly, hey, your problem is due to your problem is on the cellular interface. I can tell you what happened there.
Great. Well, that's all very exciting. I guess then let's move a little bit, put our future hats on. I guess what, if you had to say, what's the state going to be of the soft-driven network, 3 years from now? I guess, I noticed, one of the big things that really stood out to me is when I got the latest Gartner on switched and wireless infrastructure, is for years, Cisco was always way up in the upper right? And then you had a bunch of people and Juniper was in the left. They're way down. I thought first from a sales perspective, they'd be higher, but they've dropped, not even high on the execution component. And the vision is nowhere either. To me, that means there's a paradigm shift going on, because for the last 20 years, it was a given, just kind of like Checkpoint was the firewall leader for 20, it had been in there for 20 years and they got disrupted somewhat by a Palo Alto, we'll say. Something happened, obviously.
I have to say, the Gartner Magic Quadrant is a personal, career milestone. It's up there in my top 3 milestones, because, you think about, Mist started in my kitchen 6 years ago, 5-6 years ago.
Amazing. Yeah.
And so we went from a blank sheet of paper to the upper right-hand corner of Gartner. So yeah, that does tell you something, that something's changing. I would say if you look at some of the very large customers we have right now, we have some very large Fortune 10 customers. Usually Fortune 10 customers don't bet on startups unless there's some architectural reason to bet on it.
Especially nowadays, since that's viewed as such a mature, switching and wireless been around for a few years. So that's to go with a startup on that. It's not like it's back in the days when, it was first coming out.
Right. So that goes back to, when we started Mist, people thought we were crazy. People were like, Bob, this is not going to work out like, this is not going to work out like you think it is. But, the thesis, and what I tell people is, if your product fit and market fit are correct, things will tend to work out. And what was true with Mist was the cloud and AI architectural change. Like, that is this, people are going to move.
And bandwidth, probably the bandwidth to enable all that in parallel, huh? I guess the cloud and compute.
Internet's getting bigger, right? The paradigm is shifting from running things on-prem to where people are, businesses don't work without the internet, right? People are starting to figure out that, they put a lot of time and effort to make sure that internet connectivity is reliable, because they're moving their software to the cloud, because fundamentally the cloud is just a much better way to develop software and maintain software, right?
Yep.
And it's really an architectural change from, 20 years ago, I was building stuff on a Linux box, embedded spaghetti code. And that is just a terrible way to do it, because, that's why it takes 9 months to get something released. 3 months of software development and then 9 months of regression testing. And then the customers still swear, did you bother to test this before you shipped it? Because you can never test all the iterations, right?
Yep. Then do you think that this just came to my mind because we were an Aerohive partner early on, and that, there was kind of the whole different paradigm shift especially with the distributed enterprise coming in, where you had the controller list. And did that help that maybe Cisco got derailed a little bit, trying to worry about controllers versus controllerless, and versus, really watching that the world could be changed. There's a way to change the world between the convergence of cloud, more bandwidth, that now you can start to focus on the application layer and get things done. And they're more worried about tactical stuff at the time,
I think Cisco, Cisco was an investor in Mist, right? So it's not like Cisco didn't know what was happening. That's what I'm saying. I think it's very hard for large companies when there's an architectural change. It's just very hard, because there's organizational changes. That's what I'm saying. Right now I've got the data science team and the customer support team tied to the hip, right? That's organizationally, that's just hard to do in a big company. Organizationally, let's start having this group work with this group type of thing. That's what I'm telling you. That's a sign of something architecturally changed. When you see big, large companies trying to get their different business units to work together, to respond to something, that's usually a clue that something's changing. So I think Cisco knows what's happening. I think it's just hard for big companies, to go through that organizational change, let alone the technology change that needs to have to go along with it.
And the revenue requirements, they got to keep Wall Street happy every quarter. And when it's a small market, it's hard to spend a lot of effort on that.
Well, and that's why startups exist, right? I mean,
Right.
To be honest, I could have stayed at Cisco, but that's the challenge, right? When you're on a quarterly budget thing, every quarter budgets change and priorities change. When you're in a startup, you're focused.
Right.
You have a pile of money, you have one mission. You don't argue about what you're going to do every quarter. You're on a mission to get something done. There's no distractions.
Exactly. So how does now Juniper start taking AI, all these lessons learned, and applying that across without getting in the same type of a deal? Or is that because it's at a different level? Does that make it easier to do because you're dealing more with automating support, which can go across multiple platforms? Juniper's got pretty open platforms because they have compute processing, CPU on all those devices and things. Or how do you see that? How do you see that playing out?
Well, I mean, at Juniper right now, right, we are extending Marvis and AI across the enterprise portfolio, right?
Okay.
We're bringing 128, bringing the SD-WAN router into it, bringing the switch, bringing the EP. We're starting to bring the client into the Marvis. So I think at Juniper right now, we are basically extending that over the whole enterprise portfolio.
Okay. Yeah, it's exciting times. Like I said, when I saw that, it had been hard. We've been a Juniper reseller. We've been Juniper for 10 years at least, and we were always kind of pigeonholed into certain use cases, kind of carrier type things, because there was wireless and there wasn't wireless. And then, they made a lot of stumbles over the years, but it sounds like they've gotten this one really right at the right time.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this opens up, for Juniper partners like yourself, right? This really opens up the conversation to your customers, right? You can have,
definitely.
And that is the point, right? The conversation you really want to have with a customer is really around this end-to-end user experience,
Yep.
And that's a paradigm shift, right, guys? We are not here to help you manage a box.
Right.
We're here to help you manage this end-to-end user experience. And I really don't care if it's a Juniper box causing the problem or a DCP. My goal here is to help you figure out what the root cause of this is. Whatever the user experience problem is.
Yep. Say a user says that, okay, I do understand that, probably Wi-Fi is a big part of and that remote user connection, especially with work at home now, is probably a lot of my help desk. So if I overlaid some of the Juniper type of this on there, what could they expect to see if they went with the Juniper Wi-Fi platform and the Marvis story?
Yeah, I mean, so like we have a remote work, we have a remote home solution right now. I think really the value in the remote home is really bringing that end-to-end visibility, especially when people are working from their home. If they have a missed access point out there, now it's very easy to kind of figure out what is going on when someone calls up and says they're having a problem inside their house. Same thing, right? You want to be able to quickly isolate it. Is it a device problem? Is it a backhaul problem, or is it some wireless problem going on inside that house? Or is it your internet provider, right? There's only a couple of things that usually can go wrong inside your home type of thing. But that's the visibility that AI ops is starting to bring to the puzzle, starting to bring to the table here.
Yep, that'll make it more critical, I would say. This kind of accelerated it even more, having the more and more distributed enterprise, the value of it.
Yeah, if I go back to your question about 3 years from now, I do believe that we're going to see AI assistants become more ingrained into IT teams. I think as we evolve this, we're going to see this AI assistant become kind of a member of the future IT team. I'm not sure it's going to be quite like the Star Trek computer scenario where it's like, computer, tell me, please tell me what's going on here. So I think that's where we're headed. Where these AI assistants, you think about them, they're really there to help. If they don't get the answer, they're there to help you get to the data you need to see relevant to the problem, right?
Right.
There's tons of log files and all this other data. You just really want something that gets you focused on the relevant data to whatever scenario you're trying to deal with.
Yep. I guess it's just making sure, people just having to adapt and not get comfortable and always be willing to leverage new technologies for what they're good at and understand what they're not good at and find ways to fill those gaps, kind of like you did with wireless and all these years.
Yeah, and like you say, it's a journey, right? I mean, if you think about the journey that, it starts with the data. First of all, you got to make sure you have the right data to answer whatever question. You got to get that data into a framework, that you can apply some data science to. And then the other key part of this is, what I've been calling conversational interface. You got to get some way for someone to naturally interact with this AI system, right? And that's kind of the, that's another part of the evolution of, how do we make this thing some sort of natural way, that an IT person can really feel comfortable, training, gaining trust and training, right?
Yep.
How are they going to work with this technology in kind of a natural way that they would work with a new employee that they've hired?
Sure. So I guess there's kind of the two phases of it. One is alerting people if something is wrong, or if you can't fix it, automatically sending an alert and saying, "Hey, you better deal with this." And then there's also the querying where you're going back and saying, "This guy has a problem. Can I fix it?" So is there a role? There's kind of a role I imagine of alerting and integrating with other systems, and then also the querying role when I want to. Now I'm at the surgery table. I want to ask some questions now.
Well, I mean, the good example is like ServiceNow, right? I mean, most of our big customers have ServiceNow to handle all their events and various, kind of the overarching management system.
Right.
We've gotten them a good examples where we've gotten Marvis to the point where, Marvis can find bad Ethernet cables, right? So at some point, the IT administrators is saying, "Hey, Marvis, I trust you. Please generate the ticket, the support ticket to fix it, and send that ticket out." Right. So that's an example where IT teams can start to offload certain tasks, right? Hey, I trust you enough to find bad cables. Don't ask my permission anymore. Just take care of it. And that's kind of the role of an AI assistant, right? Yes, I trust you enough to take care of bad cables. I don't need to waste my time anymore trying to figure that out.
Sure. Yeah, those are they can manifest themselves in a lot of ways if you don't know where to look at first, right? I mean, you can get all kinds of weird connections, and I've seen that enough times over 30 years.
I mean, bad cables, a classic one, right? It's like, hey, that's the last thing on your list to worry about is, is the cable bad? It's like not the most likely story, but when it is, it causes a lot of confusion because it's like, okay, if it doesn't fail hard, then you start getting weird packet drops that you don't expect to happen.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of those things that it's really exciting where this could head. So I guess I'd like to just let me see here. I had one wrap it up with going over now back to Chris, and he had some questions. He just wanted to. Chris has always been fascinated by people like yourself as well as I have been. People that have been these serial entrepreneurs, and he had a couple of questions he wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And Bob, that's some awesome information. Your ability to kind of make it understandable for the non-technical was extremely helpful to myself to understand that. I got a couple questions. One, I guess, where did you come up with the name Mist?
Well, there's various versions of that story. Brett Galloway and I founded the company, I think back in June of 2014. And I think it was like, you think about cloud, so Mist is like cloud grounded in reality. That was kind of the original thesis of cloud, Mist, grounded in reality, kind of the.
Very cool. What about Marvis?
Oh, now that one you should know. Okay, Kirk must know this one. Marvis.
Now you got me on the spot here, just thinking. I know it's one of those guys from the start, one of the high tech shows, right? Marvis was the guy that talked. Or is that?
You ever never watch Iron Man?
Oh,
yeah. So who is the AI assistants for Iron Man?
Oh,
yeah, that's what I knew. I knew that was the story. I just couldn't remember all the right characters.
Yeah, I should have got that one.
Yeah, the more funny thing about that is if you actually watch, I forget what episode it is, they actually called, I think the AI system was named Friday in one of them.
Yep, I remember that. Yeah. Friday, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, Marvis, Jarvis, that was kind of like, hey, we're going to build an AI assistant on par with Jarvis.
So I think there was a detective called Joe Friday too, wasn't there, on one of the shows? Yeah. Kind of all plays together.
We can start with
I know we can jump around, but I just thought of one thing. I guess if you wanted to comment at all about domain specific artificial intelligence and maybe where that could play into the big picture of artificial intelligence across the whole enterprise? Where do you see that general purpose AI versus domain specific? How do you see that evolving over the next 3 years?
Yeah, I mean, people usually refer to this as general purpose AI. This is kind of the vision of, do we really, how far away are we from the Terminator version of AI, where you have AI that can answer general questions of any sort type of thing. And that was kind of like, if you look at Jeopardy and, Jeopardy and Watson, right? That was kind of an open-ended question, right? Watson had to answer questions from every possible category.
Right.
To that extent, they've done it, right? I mean, there's examples where Watson was built to answer questions from a very wide category of stuff. Now that's usually, when people think about, general AI, when do we get to a real intelligence that can answer questions about finance, healthcare, IT, anything like that? That's kind of the sci-fi 100 years. When do we get to that tipping point of, when do we have intelligence that is, on par with human? That's kind of the bigger question.
Yeah, do you end up like with the manager of managers in IT though, or because people that might have AI for their applications, AI for like their network stuff, and how does that all integrate together? I guess as part of the bigger picture.
I don't know if there's going to be one big AI to rule them all. I mean, I think we're going to see AI, for the foreseeable future, we're going to see AI involved in different verticals, right? We're going to see AI for healthcare. We're going to see AI get to the point where, it can basically do diagnosis on par better than your doctor. I think we're going to see AI, for self-driving cars. I mean, I see the day when it'll be illegal to drive, right?
Sure.
We'll get to the point where, hey, these self-driving cars have a better safety record. What do you do then? What do you do when all of a sudden, your car can drive better? So, you almost don't want people driving anymore, right? It's like, I don't want you to kill anyone. So I do see even in IT networking, where the AI gets better, like the bad cable, right? The AI assistants probably can find bad cables faster and better than any human could ever go through and find a bad cable in your network.
Exactly.
So I think that's how I see AI evolving over the next couple of years, right? It's going to be, domain specific. I think people talk about the, Terminator. When do we get that day? I mean, people actually think that day is coming. There will be a day when, AI gets to the point where it is on par with the human in terms of solving generic problems.
Is there a crossover, I guess, between like the algorithms and I guess really what we're a lot of times trying to do is model a workflow that a domain expert would go through to solve a problem, right? So that's not necessarily an algorithm, but it's more of modeling the workflow or the thought process. Is there a difference there, or am I thinking?
Yeah, there's a difference between what they call rule-based type of logic, and that's what we used to do, right? We used to create kind of rules-based things to mimic things. What's really changed, and I would say this happened probably around 2014, deep learning, right?
Yep.
This is where basically we're starting to do things that you really are not based on rules. They are starting to mimic kind of human behavior, being able to recognize the difference between the cat and dog. That's not a rules-based system. That's a very complicated neural network with weights in it that basically you've trained to do that. That's what your car does, right? Your car is getting trained to recognize stop signs and objects and people around it, and so that's the big transition that happened, and when I looked at it, it looks like around 2014, if you look at the Google data, that's when AI ops search, all that stuff started to take off right then. Right. Okay. And I think it's mostly because, these neural networks got big enough to solve real world problems, right? We got enough compute power, enough data to train them, that we started solving interesting problems, compared to, like I said, back 20 years ago, I did my master's. I was trying to build a little neural network to recognize, for radio communication stuff. It's just, you couldn't build something big enough, right? You couldn't build neural networks big enough there to do every thing. Now we got billions of this big, right? These things are, the number of nodes is millions, tens of millions.
Right. Last question, because I just keep thinking about like kind of like what Amazon did is they kind of solved the artificial intelligence issue, like on purchasing. If so and so bought this, this, and this, they probably want that. So basically taking the data and looking backwards for relationships they weren't aware of for shopping. Like if you like these three things, you probably like that. Does that apply to is that what any of that kind of stuff into the network world?
Yeah, that's what they call collaborative filtering and recommendation engines.
Yeah.
It applies, directly. I'm trying to think. We don't use a collaborative filter for an IT purpose. I would say the biggest thing I've seen, for me, when we did anomaly detection, we started with kind of this moving average thing, kind of like we would naturally think, hey, I'll just keep track of the average. Then we went to something called ARIMA. It really wasn't until we got to what they call these LSTM, long-term, short-term memory neural networks. Those fundamentally change the number of false positives you get. So that's an example where deep learning and neural networks making a difference in our world, right? Our networking world, right? You're doing trying to do some sort of time series. And when you dig into it, what you find out is what these networks, what these neural networks do, they're multiple dimension. Besides predicting the average, they're also predicting the confidence interval. Right? They're not just predicting, here's what the average should be. They're also predicting what the confidence interval is, whether or not it's an anomaly or not.
Okay.
And this is where these deep learning networks are going to make a difference in our networking world, right?
Sure.
Our problem is false positives. It's not like we haven't tried this before.
Right.
This is, we generated so much false positives. The IT guy said, don't, stop calling me at 2 a.m. They stop crying wolf.
Right. No, I get it. Okay. Well, this all helps to show that this is not something that it does take a while. You guys have spent 6 years really trying to hone this thing, and it's not something that someone can just pick up and copy. I guess your competitors can't just pick up and copy overnight.
Well, there's a barrier to entry, right? I mean, I don't think we don't have the corner on AI ops per se, but it's not a feature that you just crank out overnight. You've got to build up the real-time pipeline. You got to get the cloud architecture built. You got to build up these frameworks.
And you got to be able to collect the right data, which is something that you thought up on the front end too, which is a little bit of a barrier to entry. Is if you can't get access to that data, you can't get very accurate.
Yeah, you get it organizationally, right? There's the organizational piece too, right?
Yep.
The data science team is not usually a bunch of network experts, right?
Right.
These are hardcore math people.
Right.
So you got to pair them up with domain experts to actually understand the problem you're trying to solve.
Yeah, that's got to be an interesting thing. Chris, I'll turn it back to you. I could talk forever here, but we got to respect Bob's time. This is all very interesting.
So I think it's pretty rare that I'd have the opportunity to sit here and talk to somebody who has sold a company to both Cisco and Juniper. So I'm going to use this opportunity to get in your head a little bit. What motivates you to get up in the morning?
I think naturally I'm a problem solver. If you look at my hobbies, I raise bees, I do wine. I just tend to like to solve problems, technical problems. If you talk to my product manager friends, they're like, Bob, you always want to work. You don't always have to solve hard problems. There's these easy problems over here you can work on too. So that's kind of like what motivates me when I get up in the morning. Is kind of I just enjoy technology. I enjoy technology, and I enjoy just trying to figure out how to make it relevant to businesses. You look at, they're both interesting problems, right? Building a company is kind of an interesting problem by itself, right? How do you actually build a company is a problem. If you treat that as a problem, right? You got to raise money, you got to get market fit right, you got to get anchor customers, you got to hire a team. That's a problem in itself, right? And then what I tell people with startups is, it's the ultimate team sport.
Yep.
Right. If you look at startups that are successful, it's usually not one person. It's like, engineering's got to be hitting. You got engineering, marketing, sales. You need everyone on the team. You need rock stars everywhere, right? You need everyone excelling in what they're doing to really get it work.
Yeah, that must have been interesting trying to sell the venture capitalists on another wireless company, although you had a pretty good track record.
Well, I would tell you there was definitely some skepticism of, you guys, is there really room for one more wireless company? What they didn't fully appreciate, it really wasn't a wireless company, right? Yeah, the play here is cloud and AI.
Yep.
Wireless happens to be where we're going to start.
Kirk, what about you? What gets you up in the morning?
Well, much smaller. Same thing. I guess it's just enjoying the industry. I enjoy watching the innovation. I've always said I'm trying to get more on the front end of it versus playing it out and selling it on the back end. I guess that's what we're trying to do now with our Chasm app, or our attack surface management app. I guess since I have you on here, I did have one quick question regarding that. How do you like, because we use we get data to do our app from a combination of open source stuff plus some of the things that we queried. Where would I start to make sure I've got the right intellectual property protections in place, that I don't just give everything away at some point, by accident? So is there law firms that specialize in that you're familiar with or anything? Or how do you, that journey, which we really haven't had to worry about in our company till now, is just making sure we understand and we're not also infringing on somebody else's, I guess,
Oh, yeah. If you were talking about IP,
making sure you're doing the best protecting application software app, I guess,
Yeah, what I mean, what I've learned is usually for most people, you seldom have a case where you have a blocking IP but what I usually recommend people is protect what you're building. I mean, there's maybe other ways to skin the cat, but make sure you protect what you've done. That makes sure that you're not stepping on anyone else's patents. And I think the other thing is you don't have to protect everything. If you can always release stuff, release up to the public, so you have to decide what you want to protect.
Right.
Ultimately, I don't think most companies are not out to enforce patents, right? Unless you're Qualcomm or someone.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
I would protect. My recommendation: protect what you build. If you have some unique thing, make sure you protect, your way of skinning the cat.
Sure. Does that manifest itself though in software, I guess, more because obviously hardware is easier to have patents. It's more of a physical thing, but like you have trademarks and copyrights and all that. Those are the easy ones, I guess. But
no. Yeah. I mean, I mean, I'm happy to have a discussion around patent theory, but everything we protect here, right? We protect all our software innovation. Right.
Okay.
Now, what you find out when you start talking to patent attorneys is you can't really protect an algorithm like LSTM. You can't protect an algorithm, but you can protect what it does if there's some action, right? That you built software that takes some action. So usually when I've talked to patent lawyers, usually they want to make sure that, that's fine that you've come up with an algorithm. The question is, what does it do?
Okay. All right.
Interesting. So Bob, what is like in the time that you started Mist, what do you think is the most important decision that you had to make, or a course correction or some point of time challenge that you had to overcome?
I would say, in both Mist and Airspace, I would say the critical thing on all these adventures is the product market fit. That's the first thing, because if you don't get that right, that usually leads to pivoting and dilution, right? When you see startups who have to pivot or do something like that, that just means that the product fit and market fit was not correct. Once you have that nailed down, it really comes down to execution. If you got the right product market fit, and that really comes down to team, right? When you start having to execute, so most of the problems in startups are mishires. You're basically, once you have the vision, the mission down, now you really got to make sure you have the right team to execute on that vision and mission.
Interesting. Thank you very much for that. What about you, Kirk? What are your thoughts on that?
It makes all kinds of sense to me right now, because we were just talking about that as we try and scale our development efforts. I said, this user interface guy is a very important hire, and a misfit on that could set you back 6 months to a year. And then now you're in a fast moving industry. You can't afford to go backwards or sideways. I guess that was just that was our next phase of what we were talking about, is scaling and making sure you get the right, right people, especially on these first few pieces, get them all right.
If you look at my adventures, right? I mean, my Metricom Ricochet venture, we went public. Usually the other critical thing in the adventures in the scaling part is the sales, right?
Yep.
usually most teams will get the technology right. I mean, usually you don't, not always true, but most people will get the technology built. Usually it's to go to a market that they didn't really think through, right? So, okay, now how are you going to sell it? And then you don't realize how much it costs. How much does a sales team cost? Like, guys, this is not cheap,
Oh,
you get to raise money, and the sales team isn't like putting a nickel in and getting a quarter out. It's like it's a forward bet, right? You put a lot of money in, and then you're going to hope this works out.
Yeah.
right. And you got to grow faster than the market and everything else.
Got to get the sales team ramped up and start selling stuff.
What we're trying to do is, because we've been around for so long, kind of what we do a lot of pen testing services, web app assessments and all that. So we're using that as a way to hang around just by doing traditional work.
Yeah.
If they're not ready to jump into like an attack surface management solution or something, we can still stay around because we've got a reputation for doing good security. So we don't have to build, a reputation up. We already got that, but we don't have a reputation for apps. So, so
that's kind of like, you got a services revenue, you got service revenue, and then you're trying to kind of basically start up a product company on this, right? So there's a lot of models where you see people start on the services business and then they start adding a product, element to it.
So we'll see if it turns out or not. It's fun. I'm enjoying it so far.
Yeah. No, I've got examples. I've got friends who've done that, right? They started in the services business and then they basically use the services to fund the product side of the business.
Yep. So yeah, it's not quite the world that you're used to with the big time player venture capitalist guys, but it's ours is a little slower moving, but it's interesting and fun, and it kind of builds off our core skill set.
Yeah. So. You got control of it.
Right. Yeah. We're not working for somebody else, I guess, at their pace. We can kind of do it at ours, and that could be good or bad, I guess,
But I tell people, when you raise money, time is the best, you have board meetings every month.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
They want their big return on that thing, right? They didn't give you the money for the fun of it.
All right. Well, I think we can wrap this up. I appreciate both of your time today. It was an absolute pleasure. By the time this gets released, I think we'll have a couple other interviews done for the IT Summit. So you'll see a lot of content being released. Any closing words?
No, I just, again, think, Bob, I really appreciate you taking your time. This is a great, I think we're just really excited actually on the Juniper front, because we've had three heads of our monster. One is the information assurance. One has always been kind of the build infrastructure solutions, the high end. And having this Juniper thing, we always enjoy, like I said, not on purpose, but we've been this anything but Cisco company for 20 some years, and we've always been kind of a stepchild in the switching and wireless world. And it's kind of fun now to be able to come front and center and kind of have the kind of being the people that can actually upturn all that. It's been a long time of playing around the edges, I guess, nibbling on the sides. Now we can head right at it. Yeah, well, I mean, these are all topics dear to my heart, so it's always fun to talk about this. And like you say, it's a small world out there in the industry. And I was at Cisco for 8 years. Oh yeah, it is. It's not like they're bad. It's just we've always had this business that made our money. Checkpoint in the security originally back 20 years ago, and the OPSEC program, and we were always kind of the underdog, being a smaller reseller when we started out. So we had to pick somebody and try and do something better. And I guess it was always
now you kind of go poke the grill in the side. Just go poke that Cisco grill. And
exactly, we poked it a few times and get called different things, but they couldn't ever threaten to cut us off though on our chain of other business. That was the beauty of it though, right? They couldn't say, well, we'll cut you off if you keep selling those other products. We didn't have to worry about that. At least we were just kind of keep them sharp, thorn in their side all the time, at least in our area.
Right. You gotta keep them honest.
Exactly.
All right. Well, I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you, and have a great day.
All right. Yeah. Thanks again, Bob. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Bye.